The rain didn't just fall that evening. It pounded against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling mansion like it was trying to break through the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, a smell that usually made Alina feel safe. But tonight, it made her feel like she was suffocating. She stood in the center of the grand foyer, her hands trembling as she smoothed out the fabric of her dress. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like a trapped bird. She wasn't alone. Her father, Arthur, stood by the fireplace, his back to her. He was a man who measured life in profit margins and legacy. Her mother, Beatrice, sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, posture so rigid she looked like a statue. "Say it again," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. He didn't turn around. He just watched the flames dancing in the hearth. Alina swallowed hard. The lump in her throat felt like a jagged stone. "I'm pregnant, Dad. I'm 12 weeks along." The silence that followed was worse than the thunder outside. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat to clutch her pearls. It was a gesture Alina had seen 1,000 times. Usually reserved for when a waiter spilled wine or a guest wore the wrong attire to a gala. But this was different. This was horror. "And the father?" Beatrice whispered, her eyes darting toward the front door, as if someone might be listening. "Please tell me it's someone we know. Please tell me it's the Harrison boy, or perhaps that young lawyer from the firm." Lena took a breath, drawing strength from the memory of the man she loved. "It's Elias. You know it's Elias." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Arthur finally turned around, his face a mask of cold fury. "The grease monkey. The boy who crawls under cars for a living. He's a mechanic, Dad, and he's a good man. He works harder than anyone I've ever met," Alina defended, her voice gaining a slight edge. "He is a nobody," Arthur spat, stepping forward. The light from the chandelier caught the anger in his eyes. "He has no name, no background, and no future. You are a Sterling. You were raised to lead, to marry into a family that adds value to our own. Instead, you've gone and dragged our name through the mud with a man who smells like gasoline and cheap beer." "He doesn't smell like beer," Alina said, her voice shaking now. "He smells like hard work. He loves me, and he loves this baby." Beatrice stood up, her face pale. "Alina, think about what you're saying. This isn't a fairy tale. You have a reputation to uphold. If the board hears about this SIF, the papers get hold of the fact that the Sterling heiress is carrying the child of a common laborer. We'll destroy everything your father has built." "That's what this is about?" Alina asked, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "The company. The reputation. What about me? What about your grandchild?" Arthur stepped closer, his presence looming over her. He looked at her not as a daughter, but as a failed investment. "There is a simple way to handle this. We have doctors. We have clinics in Europe where no one will ask questions. You will go there, you will take care of the situation, and you will never see that boy again. We will tell everyone you went on a sabbatical. When you return, we will find you a proper match." Alina felt a cold chill run down her spine. She placed a hand over her stomach, a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed until that very moment. "I'm not doing that. I'm keeping my baby." The room went deathly quiet again. Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked at his wife, who looked away, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. "If you walk out that door with that child in you," Arthur said, his voice sounding like cracking ice, "you walk out with nothing. You will not have a cent of your trust fund. You will not have the Sterling name. You will be dead to this family. You'll be living in whatever hovel that boy can afford, scrubbing floors and wondering where your next meal is coming from. Is that the life you want?" Alina looked at her father. She saw the wealth, the gold-framed portraits, the marble floors, and the suffocating expectations. Then she thought of Eliasta, the way he stayed up late studying engine designs, the way he held her hand when she was scared, and the way his eyes lit up when she told him the news. He didn't have a mansion, but he had a heart that was bigger than this entire house. "I'd rather be poor with him than live another day in this cold house with you," Alina said, her voice steady. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply pointed toward the grand mahogany doors. Then go. Go to your mechanic. See how long his love lasts when the bills start piling up and the hunger sets in. Arthur, wait, Beatrice started, but one look from her husband silenced her. She sat back down, her face turning into a mask of indifference. Alina didn't wait for them to change their minds. She knew they wouldn't. She turned and walked toward the stairs, her heels clicking on the marble. She went to her room and grabbed a single suitcase. She didn't pack the designer dresses or the expensive jewelry. She packed the essentials, the clothes that were practical, the few photos she cherished, and the small wooden bird Elias had carved for her on their first anniversary. As she walked back down the stairs, her mother was still sitting in the chair, staring at the wall. Her father was back by the fireplace, his back turned once again. Alina stopped at the door. I hope one day you realize that people are more important than names. Neither of them responded. She opened the door, and the cold wind whipped inside, bringing the rain with it. She stepped out onto the porch, the heavy door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her soul. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She walked down the long, winding driveway, her suitcase getting heavier with every step. Her thin coat was soaked through within seconds. By the time she reached the iron gates at the edge of the estate, she was shivering uncontrollably. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling against the wet screen. She dialed Elias. He picked up on the first ring. Alina. Is everything okay? It's pouring out there. His voice was warm and full of genuine concern. Elias? She sobbed, the weight of the night finally breaking her. I'm at the gate. They kicked me out. I have nowhere to go. Stay right there, he said, his voice turning firm and protective. Don't move. I'm coming for you. I'm coming right now. Lena stood under the flickering light of a street lamp, the rain washing away her tears as she looked back at the dark silhouette of the mansion. She was terrified, and she was cold, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was finally breathing. She was no longer a sterling heiress. She was just a woman, a mother. She was going home to the only person who truly saw her. The small apartment was a world away from the marble halls Elena had grown up in. It was located on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and fried onions. The radiator hissed and clanked throughout the night, sounding like a tired heartbeat. When Elias first carried her suitcase through the door that rainy night, he looked at her with an expression that was half pride and half apology. He knew it wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer. In those first few weeks, silence was the hardest thing for Alina to get used to. Not a peaceful silence, but the absence of the staff. It's the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of her father's business calls. Here, the silence was filled with the sounds of the city sirens in the distance, neighbors arguing through thin walls, and the constant hum of the refrigerator. Elias was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He woke up at 5 every morning, his body stiff from sleeping on the edge of their small bed so Alina could have the most room. He would make her a cup of tea and leave a small note on the kitchen table before heading to the garage. Usually, the notes were simple. Eat something green today. Love you. Alina tried to do her part. She found a job working at a local bakery. It was physically demanding. Standing on her feet for 8 hours a day while her belly slowly began to swell, but she refused to complain. She didn't want Elias to think she regretted her choice. Every time her back ached or her feet swelled, she thought about the cold look in her father's eyes, and she felt a surge of strength. She wasn't just Alina anymore. She was a mother. One Tuesday evening, Elias came home later than usual. His face was streaked with grease, and he looked exhausted. He dropped his bag by the door and sat at the small wooden table that doubled as their dining area and his workspace. The car from the shop today, he started, rubbing his eyes. It was one of those high-end imports. The cooling system is a mess. They designed them to look pretty, but they can't handle real heat. It's a waste of money. Alina sat across from him, pushing a plate of simple pasta toward him. You always say that. You always say you could build it better. Elias looked at her, a spark of something bright in his tired eyes. Because I can, Alina. I've been sketching it out. A system that uses the engine's own heat to regulate the temperature without drawing extra power. It could change how logistics companies run their fleets. It would save them millions in fuel and repairs. He pulled out a crumpled notebook from his back pocket. It was filled with drawings, intricate diagrams of pipes, valves, and formulas that looked like a foreign language to Alina. "Why don't you show it to someone?" she asked softly. Elias laughed, a dry, tired sound. "Who? I'm a guy who changes oil for $40 an hour. People like your father don't listen to guys like me. They think if you don't have a degree from a fancy school, your brain doesn't work the same way." He reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was rough, and no matter how hard he scrubbed, there was always a bit of oil under his fingernails. To Alina, it was the most comforting hand in the world. "I don't need a fancy office to know you're a genius," she said. But the struggle was real. By the 5th month of the pregnancy, the bakery manager told Alina he couldn't keep her on. He said it was a liability, but she knew it was because she was moving slower than she used to. That night, she sat in the dark living room, crying silently. She felt like she was failing. She had no money, no family, and now, no job. When Elias came home, he didn't panic. He just sat on the floor at her feet and leaned his head against her knees. "We'll be okay," he whispered. "I'll take the night shift at the trucking depot. They need a mechanic on site for the long-haul rigs. It's more money." "But you'll never sleep," Alina cried. "You'll work all day and all night. It's not forever," he promised. "It's just until the baby comes." The next few months were a blur of exhaustion. Elias became a ghost in his own home. He would come in as the sun was rising, kiss Elena's forehead, sleep for 3 hours, and then head back to the garage. He lost weight, his cheekbones becoming sharp. But he never complained once. In the quiet hours when he was gone, Alina started researching. She used the library's computer to look up patent laws and tech incubators. She saw how Elias pored over his notebook during his 20-minute lunch breaks. She saw the passion in his eyes when he talked about his cooling system. She realized that while her family looked down on him for what he did, they had no idea who he actually was. One afternoon, a man in a sharp suit knocked on their door. He was a lawyer representing the Sterling family. He didn't even step inside, looking around the hallway with a sneer. "I have an offer from your father," the lawyer said, handing her a thick envelope. "He's willing to set up a trust for the child. $5 million. But there are conditions. You have to move to a private estate in another state. And the father, this Elias, can have no legal contact with the child. Ever." Alina felt a surge of pure, hot protective rage. She didn't even open the envelope. She ripped it in half right in front of the man's face. "Tell my father that his money is as cold as he is," she said, her voice trembling with power. "My child will grow up knowing what a real man looks like. And a real man doesn't buy people's souls." She slammed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. When Elias came home that night and she told him what happened, he didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to his desk, picked up his notebook, and looked at it for a long time. "They think they can buy us because they think I'll never be anything," Elias said. His voice low and steady. "You are everything," Elena said. "I'm going to finish this," Elias said, pointing to the diagrams. "Not just for the money, but so they never, ever have the right to look down on us again. I'm going to make sure our daughter never has to choose between a roof over her head and the people she loves." From that night on, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The struggle was still there, the bills were still high, and the food was still basic, but there was a new energy. Elias spent every spare second refining his design. He used his connections at the trucking depot to test his theories on old, scrapped parts. Alina watched him work by the light of a single lamp, the sound of his pencils scratching against the paper becoming the soundtrack to their life. She realized that her father had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to break them, but all he had done was give Elias a reason to win, as her due date approached. The apartment was filled with old baby clothes from thrift stores and a second-hand crib that Elias had sanded and repainted until it looked brand new. They were poor in money, but they were becoming rich in purpose. On the night Alina went into labor, Elias didn't panic. He carried her down the 4 flights of stairs, his arms strong and steady. As they drove to the public hospital in his battered old truck, he held her hand. "Everything changes now," he whispered. He was right. But he wasn't just talking about the baby. He was talking about the fire he had lit inside himself, a fire that was about to burn down the world the Sterlings thought they owned. The 3 years that followed the birth of their daughter, Lily, were a blur of sleepless nights, greasy hands, and a growing hope that flickered like a candle in a dark room. Life didn't get easier overnight. In fact, for the first year, it got much harder. Elias was working 16 hours a day, split between the garage and the depot. While Alina managed the house and cared for a baby in a room that was often too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. But something had shifted inside Elias. He wasn't just working to survive anymore. He was working to build a fortress. Every night, after Lily was finally asleep and Alina was resting, Elias would sit at that same small wooden table. He had moved on from sketches to a small, second-hand laptop he'd bought from a pawn shop. He taught himself how to use design software. He stayed up until 3 a.m., emailing engineering firms, tech blogs, and independent investors. He sent 99 emails and received 98 rejections. Most people didn't even reply. The ones who did told him his ideas were unrealistic, that he lacked the proper academic credentials to be taken seriously. But the 99th person was a retired logistics executive named Arthur Knott, like Elena's father, but a kind, older man who had started his own career on a factory floor. He saw the logic in Elias's design. He saw how the cooling system didn't just save energy, prevented engine wear in a way no one else had thought of. They met in a greasy diner. Elias showed up in his work clothes because he didn't have time to change. The older man looked at his oil-stained hands and then at the brilliant designs on the laptop screen. He didn't see a grease monkey. He saw a disruptor. He gave Elias a small seed investment, just enough to build a real prototype and file the international patents. For 2 years, Elias and Alina kept their heads down. They didn't move into a bigger house. They didn't buy fancy clothes. Every penny Elias made from the garage went to the baby and the apartment. And every penny from the investment went back into the company he named EV Innovations. He named it after Alana that he stood for her, his North Star. While Elias was rising in secret, the Sterling family was falling in public. Alina would occasionally see her father's face in the business section of the newspapers she used for Lily's craft projects. The headlines were becoming grimmer. Sterling Logistics faces lawsuit over faulty fleet, or old guard failing. Why Sterling is losing the tech race. Arthur Sterling had been too arrogant to change. He believed that the Sterling name alone would keep the company afloat. He refused to invest in new sustainable technology, calling it a passing fad. He stayed with his old gas-heavy trucks and his outdated tracking systems. Slowly, his biggest clients began to leave. They wanted efficiency and green energy. Things the Sterling family couldn't provide. Alina felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. She didn't want to see her mother lose her home, but she also felt a sense of justice. Her father had thrown her away because he thought she was a liability to his legacy. Now, that legacy was turning to ash because he was too blind to see the world changing around him. By the time Lily turned 3, the prototype was no longer just a drawing. It was the industry standard. A massive European vehicle manufacturer had signed a deal with Elias to install his cooling system in every new truck they built. The grease monkey was suddenly the owner of a patent worth tens of millions of dollars. One afternoon, Elias came home early. He wasn't wearing his grease-stained jumpsuit. He was wearing a simple, high-quality button-down shirt and dark jeans. He looked rested for the first time in years. He walked over to Alina, who was playing on the floor with Lily, and handed her a set of keys. "What's this?" she asked, looking at the silver keychain. "It's for the office," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the house. The new one. The one with the yard and the big kitchen you wanted." Alina looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You did it, Elias. You really did it." "We did it," he corrected her. "You stayed when you could have gone back to the gold and the marble." You believed in me when I was covered in soot and didn't have a dime. This isn't my success, Elena. It's ours. But Elias had one more thing to do. He had been watching the Sterling Company's stock prices plummet. He knew they were weeks away from a total collapse. He knew that the bank was preparing to seize his father-in-law's assets. He could have let it happen. He could have sat back and watched them lose everything. Instead, he went to his office as sleek, modern space in the heart of the city's tech district, and called his legal team. I want you to make an offer for Sterling Logistics, Elias told them. I want the whole thing. The warehouses, the fleet, the name. But keep the buyer's name confidential. I want to meet them in person for the final signing. The lawyers were confused. Sir, that company is a sinking ship. Why would you want it? Elias looked at a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of Alina on the night they moved into their tiny apartment. Tired and pregnant, but smiling as she ate a bowl of cheap noodles. Because I want to show them what a nobody can build, Elias replied. The stage was set. Sterlings were desperate, clutching at straws and praying for a miracle. They had no idea that the miracle was coming from the very person they had cast out into the rain. Lena knew the meeting was coming, and she felt a sense of closure approaching. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just ready for her father to see the truth. As Elias prepared for the meeting, he didn't put on an expensive watch or a flashy suit to show off. He chose a simple, dark suit that made him look like the leader he had become. He looked in the mirror and remembered the man who used to wash his hands with industrial soap for 20 minutes just so he wouldn't get oil on Elena's skin. He was still that man. But now, he was the man who held the keys to the Sterling Kingdom. The morning of the meeting was unusually quiet. City outside was bustling, but inside the headquarters of EV Innovations, there was a sense of calm that only comes when a long journey is about to reach its destination. Elias stood by the window of his top-floor office, looking out at the skyline. He wasn't thinking about the millions of dollars he was about to spend or the technical details of the buyout. He was thinking about the night he had carried, laying a suitcase up for flights of stairs in a building that smelled like damp plaster. Alina walked into the office holding Lily's hand. Lily was wearing a bright yellow dress, her curls bouncing as she ran toward her father. Alina looked radiant. She wasn't wearing the heavy, restrictive jewelry her mother used to force on her. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress and a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that hadn't been there when she lived in the mansion. Are you ready? Lena asked softly, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. I've been ready for 3 years, Elias said, turning to kiss her forehead. But I want you to be the one who walks in first. I want them to see you. Across town, in the boardroom of Sterling Logistics, the atmosphere was the polar opposite. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table that had seen better days. The wood was scratched, and the room felt cold. Beatrice sat beside him, her face thin and anxious. They were surrounded by advisors and lawyers, all of whom were looking at their phones or whispering in hushed, worried tones. Who is this buyer? Arthur demanded, slamming his hand on the table. My people have been digging for days. EV Innovations? It popped up out of nowhere 3 years ago, and now they own half the patents in the industry. How can we not know who the CEO is? They've kept a very tight lid on the leadership. Mr. Sterling, one of the lawyers replied, but they are our only hope. The bank is going to freeze the accounts at noon. If we don't sign this deal, we lose the house, the fleet, everything. Beatrice looked at the door. I just want this to be over, Arthur. Maybe we can retire to the cottage in the north. The cottage is leveraged, Beatrice, Arthur snapped. Everything is on the line. We are Sterlings. We don't just retire into the shadows. Just then, the heavy double doors at the end of the boardroom swung open. The room went silent. A woman stepped in, her head held high. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur stood up so quickly his chair scraped harshly against the floor. Alina, Beatrice whispered. Alina didn't say anything at first. She walked slowly toward the table, her eyes scanning the room she had once been so intimidated by. She looked at her father, seeing the age lines on his face and the desperation in his eyes. He didn't look like a giant anymore. He looked like a tired man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a storm. Hello, Mother. Hello, Father, Alina said, her voice calm and steady. What is this? Arthur growled, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Did you come here to gloat? To see us at our lowest? I came here because my husband is interested in your company, Elena replied. Your husband? Arthur laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. The mechanic? What, did he win the lottery? Shh. Does he think he can play at being a businessman because he saved up a few $1,000s? Shh. Before Elena could answer, another figure stepped through the door. Elias walked in, carrying Lily. The room seemed to shrink as he entered. Didn't look like the boy in the grease-stained jumpsuit they remembered. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire with his own 2 hands. He set Lily down, and she immediately ran to Elena's side. Elias walked to the opposite end of the table from Arthur. He didn't sit down, just placed his hands on the back of a chair and looked at the man who had once told him he was nothing. I don't think we've been formally introduced, Elias said. I'm the CEO of EV Innovations, but you already knew that. You've been trying to buy my cooling systems for your trucks for the last 6 months? You just didn't know you were talking to me? The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur's face turned a deep shade of red, then went deathly pale. He looked at the legal documents on the table, then back at Elias. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The miracle investor, the person who was about to save his life's work, was the man he had thrown out into the rain. This is a joke, Arthur stammered, looking at his lawyers. Tell me this is some kind of sick joke. The lawyers looked down at their laps. The paperwork is legitimate, sir. EV Innovations is the parent company. They have the funds ready for transfer. Beatrice was staring at Lily. Is that my granddaughter? Elena pulled Lily closer. This is Lily. She's 3 years old. She likes drawing, and she knows more about engine parts than most of your mechanics, thanks to her father. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. The wall of pride she had built over decades was starting to crack. But she didn't know how to step over the rubble. Elias slid a single piece of paper across the table toward Arthur. These are the terms. I buy Sterling Logistics. I keep the name, but I replace the entire board of directors. Every truck in the fleet will be retrofitted with my technology. And as for you, Arthur... Arthur looked up, his eyes defensive. What about me? You'll stay on as a consultant for 1 year to help with the transition. You'll have an office, but no voting power. You will report to me, Elias said. And you will receive a salary that allows you and Beatrice to keep your home. But the house will no longer belong to you. It will be owned by the company. You want to own my house? Arthur whispered. I want. To make sure you never have the power to lock the door on your own blood ever again, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. You told Elena she'd be living in a hovel. You told her I would leave her when things got hard. But look around this room, Arthur. You're the one losing your home. I'm the one buying it back for you. Arthur looked at the pen on the table. He looked at his wife, who was quietly sobbing. He looked at the daughter he had disowned, who was now the only reason he wouldn't be on the street by nightfall. With a shaking hand, Arthur picked up the pen. He signed the document, his signature looking small and jagged on the page. I did what I thought was best for the family, Arthur said, his voice cracking. No, Elena said, stepping forward. You did what was best for the name. Elias did what was best for the family. There's a difference. Elias took the signed paper and handed it to his lawyer. He didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He just looked at Arthur with a sense of pity. The transfer will be complete within the hour, Elias said. We're going to take Lily to the park now. I suggest you spend the afternoon thinking about what kind of grandfather you want to be, because the businessman you used to be doesn't exist anymore. Elias, Elena, and Lily turned and walked out of the room. As they moved through the hallway of the Sterling building, employees, the ones who had worked for Arthur for years, watched them with a mix of awe and curiosity. They knew the wind had shifted. They knew the old era was over. Once they were in the elevator, Elena leaned her head against Elias's arm. That was harder than I thought it would be, she admitted. It's over now, Elias said, squeezing her hand. The past can't hurt us anymore. We don't just have a future, Elena. We have the keys to the world, they said, we weren't allowed to live in. As the elevator reached the lobby, Lily looked up at them. Can we get ice cream now, Daddy? Elias laughed, the sound echoing in the glass lobby. We can get all the ice cream you want, kiddo. We can get the whole shop if you want. They walked out into the sunlight. a family that had been forged in the fire of rejection and come out stronger on the other side. They were no longer running away from anything. They were walking toward a life they had built themselves brick by brick, and grease stain by grease stain. The months following the buyout were a strange time of transition. The news of the takeover had hit the industry like a tidal wave. People couldn't stop talking about how the legendary Sterling Logistics had been bought out by a silent giant like EV Innovations. But for Elias and Alina, the victory wasn't about the headlines or the money in the bank. It was about the quiet moments of peace that they had fought so hard to earn. Elias stayed true to his word. He didn't kick Arthur and Beatrice out of the mansion. Instead, he moved the company headquarters into a more efficient space and allowed the older couple to remain in the house. The deed now sat in a safe in Elias's office. It was a constant, silent reminder of how the world had flipped upside down. One Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after the signing, Alina decided it was time to visit. She hadn't been back to the house for a social visit since the night she was kicked out. She drove up the long, winding driveway in a modest but high-end electric SUV, a far cry from the battered truck she and Elias had shared during the lean years. Lily sat in the back, kicking her feet and singing a song she'd learned in preschool, when the heavy oak doors opened. It wasn't a butler who greeted them. It was Beatrice. She looked different. The rigid, cold perfection she used to maintain had softened. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed, and she was wearing a simple cardigan instead of a designer suit. "Alina," Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. "You came." "I told you we would, Mom," Alina said, stepping inside. The house felt different. It was still grand, but it didn't feel as cold as it used to. Maybe it was because the power dynamic had shifted. Maybe it was because the people inside had finally been humbled by the reality of life. They found Arthur in the garden. He wasn't sitting at a desk barking orders into a phone. He was standing near a rose bush, looking at a set of blueprints for the new electric fleet Elias had assigned him to oversee. He looked up as they approached, and for the first time in her life, Alina saw her father look unsure of himself. "The new cooling vents," Arthur said, holding up the paper as an excuse for the conversation. "They're brilliant, Elias. I've been looking at the data from the first 50 trucks. The efficiency is up 30%. I didn't think it was possible." Elias, who had walked up behind Alina, nodded respectfully. "It's possible when you design for the machine, not just for the profit, Arthur." Arthur sighed and sat down on a stone bench. He looked at his hands that had never known the grit of a garage. "I spent 40 years thinking I knew everything. I thought the name Sterling was a shield that would protect us from everything. I was wrong. I was wrong about the business, and I was wrong about you." He looked at Alina, his eyes glassy. "I was wrong about my own daughter." The apology was late, and it didn't fix the years of struggle or the night Alina had spent shivering in the rain. But it was honest. Alina sat down next to him. "You didn't see me, Dad?" she said gently. "You saw a part of your brand? But Elias saw me. He saw a person." Lily ran over then, clutching a handful of daisies she'd picked from the edge of the lawn. She held them out to Arthur. "For you, Grandpa." The word Grandpa seemed to hit Arthur harder than the bankruptcy ever had. He took the flowers with a shaking hand and pulled the little girl into a clumsy hug. Beatrice stood nearby, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Over the next year, the family began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, and Arthur still struggled with his pride from time to time. But the foundation was different now. It was built on truth rather than a polished image. Elias's company continued to grow, but he never moved into a mansion of his own. He and Alina bought a beautiful, comfortable home with a huge workshop in the back. On the weekends, you could often find the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm under the hood of an old car, teaching his daughter how to check the oil. "Always remember where the power comes from," Lily Elias would say, his hands covered in that familiar black grease. "It doesn't come from the title or the money. It comes from the work you're willing to do when nobody is watching." Lena would watch them from the kitchen window, a feeling of deep, settled happiness in her chest. She had lost a fortune and a name, but she had gained a life that was real. She had watched the man they looked down on change everything, not by being cruel, but by being better than everyone expected him to be. The story of the Sterlings and the mechanic became a legend in the city. But for the people involved, it was just the truth. It was a story about what happens when you bet on the person instead of the pedigree. As the sun set over their home, casting long shadows across the grass, Lena knew that the cycle of coldness and pride had finally been broken. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of a new kind of legacy, one built on love, hard work, the courage to start over when the world turns its back on you. The man they looked down on hadn't just saved a company, he had saved a family. And as Elias wiped his hands and walked toward Alina, a smile on his face and his daughter on his shoulders, it was clear that the greatest wealth they would ever own was the life they had built together in the quiet spaces between the struggles. The sun rose over the city, but for the first time in many years, the light didn't feel like a countdown to another day of stress for the Sterling family. Instead, it felt like a fresh start. While the main chapters of their struggle had closed with the buyout and the initial confrontation, the real work of living a new life was just beginning. It is one thing to win a battle, but it is another thing entirely to build a lasting peace. Elias sat in his new office, but he didn't feel like the king of the world. He felt like the same man who used to count pennies to make sure Alina had enough milk and bread. Success hadn't changed his heart, but it had changed his perspective. He looked at the vast network of the Sterling company, now his company, and realized that there were hundreds of families, just like his old one, depending on him for their livelihood. He didn't want to be a boss who sat on a high floor and never saw the faces of his workers. He wanted to be a leader who remembered the smell of the garage floor. Alina, meanwhile, had found her own calling. She didn't want to just be the wife of a successful CEO or the daughter of a former tycoon. She used her experience of being cast out to start a foundation. It wasn't a charity that just handed out checks. It was a program designed to help young women who had been disowned or abandoned find their footing. She set up housing, childcare, and job training in the technical fields Elias specialized in. She wanted to make sure that no woman ever had to choose between her child and her future the way she almost had to. One afternoon, a young woman walked into Elena's office. She looked exactly like Elena had 3 years ago, frightened, exhausted, and holding a small bag of her only belongings. She had been told by her family that she was a disappointment. Elena didn't give her a lecture. She simply walked around her desk, gave the girl a glass of water, and said, "I know exactly how you feel. And I'm telling you right now, this is not the end of your story. It's just the middle." As the months turned into a year, the relationship between Elias and Arthur took an unexpected turn. Arthur, who had once been a man of iron and ego, began to find joy in the technical side of the business. Since he no longer had the pressure of being the sole provider of the Sterling legacy, he started actually learning how the engines worked. He spent time in the research labs with the young engineers. He stopped wearing his expensive suits and started wearing practical work clothes. One day, Elias found Arthur in the testing bay, covered in a light dusting of metal shavings. Arthur was laughing with a junior technician over a design flaw they had just corrected. "Oh, look like you're actually having fun," Elias said. Leaning against the doorframe, Arthur wiped his forehead and looked at his son-in-law. "For 30 years, Elias, I was chasing a shadow. I was so worried about what the world thought of me that I forgot to enjoy the work. I was a prisoner of my own name. You didn't just take my company, you set me free from it." It was a moment of profound healing. Elias realized that his revenge hadn't been about making Arthur suffer. It had been about showing him a better way to live. Beatrice, too, found a new path. She began to spend her days at Elena's foundation, helping the young mothers learn how to navigate the world. She realized that her high society skills, the ability to speak with poise, to organize events, and to navigate bureaucracy, could be used for something far more important than gala dinners. She became a fierce advocate for the women in the program, often using her old connections to shame wealthy donors into contributing to the cause. Lily, the center of their universe, grew up surrounded by these different worlds. She knew the stories of the tiny apartment and the night of the rain. But she also knew the responsibility of their current life. She spent her weekends between the garden at the mansion and the workshop at her father's office. She grew up seeing that a person's worth wasn't in their bank account, but in how they treated the person who had nothing to give them in return. The story reached its true climax on the 4th anniversary of the night. Alina left the mansion. They decided to hold a small dinner at the old estate. It wasn't a grand party with hundreds of guests. It was just the 5 of them: Elias, Alina, Lily, Arthur, and Beatrice. The table was set with the fine china Beatrice loved, but the atmosphere was relaxed. They laughed and shared stories. At one point, Lily climbed onto Arthur's lap and asked him to tell her a story about when her mommy was a little girl. Arthur didn't talk about the schools or the trophies. He talked about Elena's kindness and her stubborn spirit, the spirit that had eventually saved them all. Elias looked around the table. He saw the woman he loved, glowing with a sense of purpose. He saw the daughter who would never know the hunger he had felt. And he saw the parents-in-law who had once been his greatest enemies, now his most unlikely allies. He realized that true success isn't about being the man at the top. It's about being the man who can build a bridge back to the people who were lost. He had changed everything, not by destroying the Sterlings, but by teaching them how to be human again. As they finished dinner and walked out into the garden to watch the stars, the rain began to fall. It was a light, warm summer rain. This time, no one ran for cover. They stood in the garden, feeling the water on their skin, and Alina reached out to take Elias's hand. "The rain doesn't feel cold anymore," she whispered. "No," Elias replied, pulling her close. "It feels like home." The man they looked down on had indeed changed everything. He hadn't just built a better engine. He had built a better life for everyone he touched. And as the lights of the city twinkled in the distance, they knew that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, not as a name or a brand, but as a family.